The situation in Normandy at the end of June was as follows. The senior Allied commanders, with the probable exception of Montgomery, believed that the Battle of Normandy had degenerated into a stalemate, a grinding battle with no sign of rapid progress. They judged success in terms of territory gained, not in the writing down of enemy forces. The commanders in the field, Dempsey, Bradley, and their various corps commanders, did not share this view because they saw the battle as an ongoing concern with only necessary let-ups. Dempsey was preparing another thrust after Ep.7, Collins's 7th Corps was about to break out of the Cotentin, and Gero's 5th Corps was preparing to move on St. Lo. The front-line commanders may not have been moving much, but they were doing plenty of fighting and preparing to do plenty more. Rommel and von Rundstedt would have agreed with the commanders at Schaeff that the battle for Normandy had now become a grinding process, and they were most unhappy about it, for they believed that the Normandy battle was not a stalemate, but a battle of attrition, and one they could only lose. This outcome was largely due to Adolf Hitler, who, like many of the commanders at Schaeff, judged success in terms of ground, and would not permit his generals to manoeuvre and still less to fall back. However, in the circumstances of June-July 1944, Hitler may have been right. The best battleground in Normandy, the killing ground in military parlance, was in the bocage. Once the Allies had broken out of that, they would have space to deploy their strength and mobility and run the slower German forces into the ground. On the other hand, if the Führer wanted his generals to fight in the bocage, he should have given them the wherewithal to fight flexibly, which meant more infantry to hold the ground so that their superior armour in quality, if not quantity, could be used for powerful thrusts and counterattacks. That said, whatever the eventual outcome, hanging on in the bocage was a good tactic for the Germans, and one they took every opportunity to exploit. As a result, Allied losses were heavy, especially in the infantry. Richard Harris of the 1st Battalion. The Suffolk Regiment, 3rd British Infantry Division, describes his battalion's action at the Château de la Londe, near Caen, on June 28th. We moved up on the morning of the 24th of June, and the plan was that the South Lancs should take the château, and the Yorks and Suffolks would follow through and capture the villages of Éperonne and La Boujoudée. It all sounded quite simple and straightforward, for the Lancs had taken possession of the château in the first attack, but been driven out by a German counterattack backed by tanks. Anyway, the South Lancs attacked, but had to withdraw after suffering heavy casualties. We in B Company of the Suffolks waited all afternoon for the word to attack, and that period of suspense is one which only those who have experienced it can know. We tried to dig in as 88mm shells and mortar bombs kept coming over, but the ground was chalky and we could make little impression. We stayed there that night, soaked in dew, and my first recollection of the unhappy day was the toe of my section mate's boot and the words, "Get your kit on, mate, we're going in soon." The whole company moved forward, and I think there was no man who was not afraid. Forward through the soaking corn as close as we dared to the curtain of death from the supporting artillery falling ahead of us. Realising that this fire preceded an attack, the Boche were sending over artillery and mortars, and casualties were inevitable. Cries of "stretcher-bearer" were soon heard, and men began to fall, their mates sticking his rifle in the ground to mark where he was before moving on. I found myself walking forward with one of the corporals and the company commander, having no idea where the rest of the section had gone. One of the platoon officers shouted for his sergeant to carry on and came back, his right arm dangling limply at his side. As we passed a group of blazing farm buildings, I could see that the company line was much thinner and straggling than it had been. From the burning farm came 4 figures in German helmets. A Sten barked and they fell. On for what seemed like hours, sometimes running, sometimes crawling, sometimes waiting and praying for the barrage to lift. There seemed even less of us now, but the Major was still in front, bellowing words of encouragement to those remaining, a leader of men if ever there was one. I followed like a shadow at his heel. Then it was tea time, but there was no tea, and men from Battalion HQ came up, men who are not usually combative, and we left our holes and went forward through the fields towards the château. So that day passed, and the day was ours, and the chateau was taken and took us that much nearer Caen. There was nothing spectacular about it. It was just one of the many battles which took place in Normandy, but the old spirit of the company had gone forever. We were made up, but the reinforcements, after June 28th, could never replace old and well-tried friends. One member of my platoon, writing to me from hospital later, had reason to remember that day, for he is still paralysed from a piece of shrapnel embedded in his spine. There must have been many more wounded, who died in the corn before they could be picked up. On D-Day, my platoon numbered 33 men. After that day, June 28th, there were 6 of us left. Of that 6, 1 was evacuated with severe shell shock in July. 3 were killed, and 2, Wakeling and myself, were wounded and evacuated. They got us all in the end. A battle of attrition is, put simply, a trial of strength, a gamble. In a battle of attrition, victory goes to the side that can afford and is willing to lose large numbers of men as long as the other side loses more men. The parallels with the 1916 Franco-German Battle of Verdun, already so apparent at Caen, were now appearing across the entire Normandy front. If the German commanders were right and the Normandy battle was indeed a battle of attrition, it was one in which the long-term advantage went to the Allies, or certainly to the Americans, who had plenty of troops to commit and were prepared to accept heavy casualties. So far, the Allies had lost 61,000 men and received 79,000 replacements, more than making up for the losses incurred. German losses so far totalled some 80,000 men, and although the German replacement figures are not complete, they certainly do not even approach the number of men lost. US divisions were now landing in Normandy at the rate of 1 a week. So many troops were arriving that it was becoming hard to find places to put them, and harder still to find ways to supply them, given the shortage of ports. There was no space to use them in the line, but they still kept coming, and the long-term signs were clear. American military muscle, those awesome, overwhelming United States resources in men and material, was now being brought to bear in Europe in a fight the German generals could not hope to win. By the end of the Normandy battle, the Americans would have landed 61 divisions in France, and more kept coming until the war ended, though even American manpower began to run out before the European war ended. This benefit to Allied manpower was restricted to the US armies. The British and Canadian armies were already at full stretch, and their frontline numbers could not be increased. By the end of June, the British and Canadians had just 6 divisions left in England as reinforcements for 21st Army Group, and before the battle ended, the British would be forced to break up 1 division in Normandy, the 59th Division, and several armoured regiments in order to reinforce the rest. If the Normandy battle developed into a battle of attrition, the British contribution was likely to get smaller. Tilting the balance of power on the Normandy battlefield therefore depended on the US armies. The US armies could be expanded considerably on July 5th. The millionth Allied soldier landed in Normandy, and he came from the United States. Hundreds of thousands more would follow, and given this increasing Allied manpower, what could the Germans do in order to maintain the struggle? One answer to sheer manpower is better technology, and here the Germans had some hopes. The V-1 flying bombs were already falling on London, where they seem to have bothered the staff at Schaeff rather more than the civilian population, and the V-2 rockets would shortly follow. At sea, the introduction of snorkel-equipped U-boats promised to restore the effectiveness of the submarine wolf packs and result in higher shipping losses. These gave the Germans hope, but fundamentally they fought on and fought well, because they were good soldiers and because they had no other choice. At this point it is necessary to recall that appeal made to Hitler by von Rundstedt and Rommel for more flexibility in handling the ground battle and consider the effect of the Allied tactical air forces. Allied air power was the key to victory in the Normandy fighting, if it could be brought to bear. In the close country of the Bocage, still in the full leaf of summer, the German units, both armour and infantry, could remain concealed if they remained in fixed positions. It was when they moved that they revealed themselves to the Allied pilots. Then in came the jabots, as the Germans called the Allied fighter bombers, scourging the ground with rockets and cannon fire. This being so, what was the advantage, never mind the possibility, of the German commanders fighting a battle of manoeuvre across the countryside of Normandy? Hitler's and his cronies at OKW Jodl and Keitel believed that a defensive battle, which reduced the advantage in numbers enjoyed by the Allies, was the best German option. That the defenders need fewer men than the attackers is common to all battle, wherever fought. However, in Normandy, the bocage and the tumbled countryside of the Odon Valley and the Suisse Normande offered additional advantages to the defence, and if the Germans gave it up voluntarily in order to fight a mobile, offensive battle, a la Western Desert in more open country, as Rommel appeared to prefer, surely it would be an entirely different matter. Indeed, had the depth of the bridgehead permitted such a tactic, one can see an astute Allied commander pulling back from the tank and troop-eating bocage country, in the hope of enticing the Germans into the open, though that assumes the Germans would have taken such bait, which seems unlikely. That option, a strategic withdrawal, reculer pour mieux sauter, did not exist in Normandy. Close behind the Allied armies lay the sea. What it comes down to is that by July 1944, the best hope of the Allies was to batter their way forward through the bocage and the Suisse Normande onto the open country beyond Caen or Saint-Lô, and the best German option was to stay in the bocage and shatter any attempt to evict them. The powers that be at Schaeff could complain that this was taking too long, and they may have had a point, but however long it took, it was the only option, and for the Allies not a bad one. Pressure against the German line was building in the west, while German forces were being contained in the east. Sooner or later something had to give. For the Germans, however, this battle was developing into a zero-sum game. In the end, the Allies were bound to win, and by any measure of military judgment, the situation of the German armies in Normandy was unsustainable. If they moved, the Allied air forces would shatter them. If they stayed where they were, they would be ground down in a battle of attrition or overwhelmed and surrounded by the eventual breakout. There was no hope whatsoever that they could push the Allies back into the sea. For the moment, however, the Germans were hanging on grimly, their professional tenacity helped by the terrain and the weather, as Montgomery points out. Writing of the US Fifth Corps' attempt to reach Saint-Lô, he states, "It was moreover apparent that the American operations, designed to secure the general line of the Perrier-Saint-Lô road as a preliminary to the main assault to the south, were going to take time. The terrain gave the German defenders every advantage. There were few very good roads across the extensive marshlands and floods. The bocage country was extremely thick. The weather was atrocious and not only restricted mobility and caused great discomfort to the troops, but seriously limited any attempt to give them support from the air, and owing to maintenance difficulties, ammunition remained in short supply. This situation dictated a pause for the moment, with the certainty of an Allied victory before too long, either through attrition or a breakthrough, as this constant Allied pressure on the German line finally proved decisive. There was, of course, the other scenario mentioned above, one much favoured by Adolf Hitler, that while his armies in Normandy kept the Allies in play, his terror weapons, the flying bomb and V-2 rockets, would destroy London. His snorkel-equipped submarines would again ravage the Atlantic convoys, and this combination would compel an Allied surrender or a negotiated settlement sheer madness, perhaps, when viewed with hindsight, but 1944 was not a year for rational thought in Germany. Besides, the German flying bomb and rocket offensive, which began a week after D-Day, did influence the powers that be at Schaeff, mainly in providing some of them with yet another reason to whinge about the slowness of the Allied armies under General Montgomery. Putting the Overlord plan aside, these armies, they felt, should by now be surging up the Channel coast and eliminating the V-1 launching sites, which had proved largely impervious to Allied bombing. The first of these weapons, the V-1, or flying bomb buzz bombs to the British, doodlebugs to the US troops in Britain, appeared over southern England on June 13th, a day after the Allied bridgehead in France was completed. Thereafter, the tempo of attack speeded up considerably and casualties mounted, greatly alarming the authorities who for no apparent reason feared a sudden collapse in civilian morale. The flying bomb was a dangerous, indiscriminate weapon, and while Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down a good number, and Allied bombers flying crossbow or no-ball missions destroyed many of their launching sites on the Channel coast, the only certain way to stop the V1 offensive was for the Allied armies to advance up the Channel coast from Normandy and overrun the launch sites. That, however, was going to take time, and meanwhile the battle in Normandy continued. While the flying bombs droned over southern England, the arrival of von Kluge at Obi West led to some changes in the German command structure, as shown C West Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. Army Group B Field Marshal Rommel. Army Group C General Oberst Blaskowitz. 15th Army General Oberst von Salmuth 7th. Army SS General Hauser Panzer Group West General Eberbach. The most significant changes, all at Hitler's behest, were the placing of Panzer Group West directly under Rommel, and its transformation from a headquarters reserve into an operational command, with 4 panzer divisions. The other major change was the removal of 15th Army from Rommel's Army Group B to the direct command of von Kluge. Geyer von Schweppenburg now vanishes from the scene for arguing with OKW that the panzer forces must be allowed to fight in a more flexible manner, that more infantry was needed, and that tanks must not be used as pillboxes. Panzer Group West would eventually, from August 5, 1944, be renamed the 5th Panzer Army. Von Kluge's first stop in France was at Rommel's HQ at La Roche-Guyon on the Seine, where he discussed the situation and the Führer's demands with the Army Group B commander. Their discussion became so acrimonious that their staff officers were ordered to leave the room. Von Kluge was a Hitler man through and through, or so it was widely believed, and after some hours of argument, simmering with rage at Rommel's pessimism and apparent disloyalty to the Führer, von Kluge departed to tour the front-line units. He returned after 2 days, somewhat subdued by all he had seen and heard. His professional conclusion that Rommel's dire assessment of the situation was all too correct was honest and, in the circumstances, courageous. From then on, Rommel was allowed to fight Army Group B as he saw fit, while von Kluge took up the thankless task of trying to talk some sense into the Führer. Meanwhile, 15th Army remained north of the Seine. The failure to employ this army against the left flank of the invasion is either an indication that the Germans were confident they could hold their line in Normandy without calling in 15th Army units, or a credit to Operation Fortitude, or to the stamina of the German forces defending the Allied hinge at Caen. Either way, retaining most of the 15th Army beyond the Seine shows a failure in German tactical planning. The infantry divisions of 15th Army would have been invaluable in the bocage, and their presence would have released the panzer units for short, savage counterattacks of the kind the Führer wanted. Instead, their 15th Army, with 250,000 well-trained troops, equipped with plenty of artillery and a useful number of tanks, sat looking south across the Seine, unable to take part in the Normandy battle until it was too late. On balance, therefore, and however dim their long-term prospects, the German commanders could be fairly satisfied with the progress of the battle so far. Cherbourg should have been taken within a week or so of the landing. It did not finally fall until D+23. Bradley had hoped to send the First Army surging through St. Lo at the end of June, but made no real progress in that direction for another 3 weeks. His advance was hindered by the floods around Carentan, which had been augmented by the heavy and persistent summer rain, by the increasing density of the bocage, and, as always, by the enemy. Poor weather also limited the operations of the tactical air forces, and frequently denied the Allied forces that support on which they had come to rely. Meanwhile, the German troops had dug in for a prolonged siege of St. Lo, where the next battle in this campaign was due to take place. A glance at the map reveals why St. Lo was the key to success on the western part of the bridgehead. All roads from the US beachheads at Omaha and in the Cotentin led towards St. Lo. South of St. Lo lay the open country that would give the large American armies space to deploy their massive strength and mobility. From St. Lo, the Americans could power ahead to the base of the Cotentin, then head west into Brittany and south towards the Loire. Unfortunately for Montgomery and Bradley, The Germans were equally aware of this fact and fought tenaciously to retain Saint-Lô and the country round about. As at Caen, when the Germans elected to defend a position, the Allies had trouble in taking it. This was the situation in early July, and while it hardly amounts to a stalemate, it was clearly vitally important for the Allies to keep the initiative, always to be attacking somewhere, whatever the territorial gain, if only to prevent the initiative passing to the enemy. Montgomery embodied this belief in his directive to Dempsey and Bradley on June 30th, the one quoted briefly above, in which he reiterated that his strategic plan was to develop the breakout situation by pinning and fighting the maximum enemy strength between Caumont and Caen, i.e. in the British and Canadian sector, while the main American thrust swung south and then east to the Le Mans-Alençon area and beyond. Beyond Alençon was the River Seine. Dempsey was to maintain the pressure at Caen to keep the panzer divisions there. First Army was to begin an offensive on the right flank, 5th Corps heading south, but pivoting on its left at Caumont to swing eastwards on a general line Caumont-Vire-Mortain-Fougères. When the 7th Corps had reached the base of the Cotentin at Avranches, 8th Corps, which actually belonged to Patton's 3rd Army, but was currently attached to Bradley's 1st Army, should head west into Brittany, towards Rennes, Saint-Malo and Brest. Brittany was important because of its ports, Brest, Saint-Malo, Lorient, but plans must now be laid, said Montgomery, for the rest of Bradley's command to direct a strong right wing in a wide sweep south of the Bocage country to successive objectives, Laval, Mayenne, Le Mans, Alençon. Here again it would be as well to study the map and understand clearly what Montgomery was now proposing. Montgomery was looking ahead and directing the First Army onto a broad front line that would set it up for a sweep right across Normandy to the Seine, with the dreaded Bocage outflanked, with the British and Canadians poised to come down on the German armies from the north, with Patton and his US Third Army sweeping east along the Loire to the south, on the right flank of First Army. This is the plan that eventually drove the Germans out of Normandy, and if indeed it is somewhat different from the one proposed in Britain on April 7th, in that the Allied hinge was further east than Caen. What of it? With this as the next phase of the campaign, the army commanders issued their orders for the forthcoming round of battle. First into the fray was Dempsey on July 4th, committing the 3rd Canadian Division of our Corps in yet another bid for their D-Day objective, the Carpiquet airfield west of Caen. This was never going to be an easy battle. Carpiquet, village and airfield, had been turned into a strong point, mined, seamed with wire, dotted with pillboxes, the open ground of the airfield covered with machine guns and anti-tank positions, and ranged to the inch by mortars and artillery. These positions were manned by the 26th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment with some tanks of the 12th SS Panzer, all well dug in. The assault on Carpiquet was to be made from west to east by the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, attacking from Marseilles and supported by the 16-inch guns of the battleship HMS Rodney, an additional infantry battalion, 3 squadrons of funnies from the 79th Armoured Brigade, a battalion of machine guns and no less than 21 regiments of artillery and 2 squadrons of rocket-firing RAF Typhoons. On the evening of July 3rd, HMS Rodney fired 15 rounds from her 16-inch guns at Carpiquet, a supposedly stunning blow against the defenders' positions. At 5 a.m. next day, the field artillery opened up, drenching the airfield with fire for 15 minutes before the infantry went forward, supported by tanks. This advance over the open airfield was immediately confronted by heavy fire from dug-in tanks and machine gun posts. 2 of the Canadian infantry battalions pressed on and took the village of Carpiquet and some of the airfield hangars, but the 3rd Infantry Battalion lost all its supporting tanks to the 88mm and was forced to withdraw. The 4th Battalion then went in through Carpiquet village, but ran headlong into a German counterattack backed by tanks, which first threw them back and then drove the Canadians out of their positions around the airfield hangars. Attack followed by counterattack was the pattern, and this set the tone for the rest of this battle for Carpiquet, which raged until the evening of July 5th. R.W. Dunning was there with the 4th Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery. As you know, it was early July before Caen was captured. The 4th Field Regiment was deployed in the reverse slope of a hill near Carpiquet airfield. We had been experiencing heavy artillery and mortar fire, and during the nights German aircraft had appeared and bombed and strafed our positions. We had acquired a battery pet, a small chicken which had had its feathers blown off by a shell burst. Christened hard tack, it became very popular and kept out of the pot. That was the only light relief, otherwise it was shelling and being shelled all the time. Another Canadian gunner, Lieutenant Norm Richardson, confirms this last point. When I joined the 14th Field Regiment in July, they were at a place nicknamed Hell's Corner, on the northern outskirts of Caen, and about 300 yards from a crossroads which Jerry kept under harassing fire. Some of the shells landed close by, so we all dug in, but on the day I arrived, a couple of the gun crews had taken advantage of a quiet period and were lying out in the sun when Jerry put 4 rounds right beside the guns, killing 2 sergeants and a gunner and wounding a bombardier and 5 gunners. By that time the regiment had lost 16 killed and 26 wounded. I must confess I was nervous. Not so much from physical fear, although from time to time there was a good deal of that, but because I was joining a group who were more experienced, and I did not want to let them down. The end result of this fresh attempt on Carpiquet was brief success, followed by failure. The Canadians managed to get onto the airfield, but were unable to take the German strongpoints around the hangars, and were eventually driven back with loss by artillery, mortar and machine gun fire and tank attacks. Bad weather prevented the RAF Typhoons assisting until the afternoon of July 4th, when they went into action against the 17 German tanks dug in on the east side of the airfield. Several tanks were knocked out with rocket fire, but it is hard to argue with the conclusion of Panzer Group West that the attempt on Carpiquet has failed. Both sides went back to shelling and mortaring their opponents, while I Corps prepared for yet another attack on Caen. The defenders of Caen had now held up all progress south on the eastern end of the Allied line for a full month. By now it was abundantly clear that any attempt to take the city of Caen by direct assault, or by outflanking thrusts to the east or west, was not going to succeed unless it was delivered with overwhelming force, a force that would involve the virtual destruction of the city. This force was applied 4 days after the failure at Carpiquet, on the evening of July 9th, when 267 aircraft of RAF Bomber Command dropped over 2,500 tons of bombs on the city centre and reduced this fine and historic Norman city to rubble. As the dust cleared and night fell, I, British Corps with 3 infantry divisions, 3rd British on the left, 59th Division in the centre, and 3rd Canadian on the right, supported by 2 brigades of tanks and the now usual massive gunfire backup from artillery and warships, prepared to move forward and root out the German defenders of Caen, street by street, house by house, room by room, if need be. Whatever had happened in the 9 days since the end of Operation Ep.7 and the fall of Cherbourg, any stalemate on the Normandy battlefront was over. Charnwood and Jupiter, July 7th to 11th. Hitler's personal and, as it proved, fatal interference in the strategy and even the tactics of the battle for France was unchecked. General B.L. Montgomery Normandy to the Baltic. At the end of June, the Second Army was still 3 divisions short of its planned strength. This was largely due to the effect of the Great Storm and those various other problems and delays already described in previous chapters. Nor had the advance inland gone to plan. The lodgement area still was well short of its hoped-for extent for July 1st. According to the pre-D-Day logistical estimates, the Allied front line should by now have taken in Lisieux, Alençon, Rennes and Saint-Malo. These estimates had been prepared mainly for the benefit of the supply services, but the ground actually taken did not amount to 20% of this area. As a result, various problems arose. 2 of these were severe congestion within the bridgehead and growing agitation for more ground at Schaeff. On July 7th, Eisenhower put this agitation in writing, telling Montgomery that we must use all possible energy to prevent a stalemate. This comment received a confident reply from Montgomery. On one thing you can be sure, there will be no stalemate. Whether this comment was entirely true depended on the swift conquest of Caen by the British and Canadians, and some progress up to and beyond Saint-Lô by the US Fifth Corps. Whole books have been written on the 1944 battle for Caen. The fight for this city had begun on D-Day, with the 3rd British Division thrust south from Sword Beach. That was followed by a series of attempted outflanking moves on both sides of the city, and steady pressure along the German defensive line in the north, between Caen and Caumont. All of this had proved useful in writing down the enemy forces and keeping them engaged in the east, but Caen was still in German hands. The pattern of the Normandy fighting, not just at Caen but right across the Allied bridgehead, had now become apparent. There would be no sudden victories in Normandy, no great advances all along the front, no early and entirely fortuitous German collapse. This was going to be a grinding battle, to wear down the opposition until something gave, and the Allied grindstone would be applied yet again to Caen by land, air, and from the sea, and with unprecedented force. The city was to be hit with all the power at General Sir Miles Dempsey's command, and this power would be employed without ceasing until the defenders of Caen either retreated or lay dead beneath the ruins. The aim this time was not to outflank the defences, as on Perche or Epsom, but to thrust directly into the city centre from the north, down a broad axis west of, but parallel to, the Caen Canal. This attack, Operation Charnwood, began with those preliminary moves by the 3rd Canadian Division at Carpiquet described in the previous chapter, moves which, it had been hoped, would take the village and airfield, and so free the western approaches to the city. The stout resistance put up by the 12th SS Panzer at Carpiquet brought this attempt to a halt on July 5th and obliged the attacking forces to pause for a couple of days before coming on again. This fresh setback at Carpiquet is hardly surprising. The defences around Caen had been stiffened considerably in the weeks since the invasion, underlining the earlier point that, difficult as it might have been to take the city on D-Day, that task could only get harder in the weeks ahead. East of Carpiquet, the city was now protected by wide minefields, anti-tank ditches and machine gun nests, all woven into an overlapping belt of fire some 2 miles wide. The essence of defence is depth, and on this part of the front the defenders' positions were deep indeed. All the villages in this belt, La Bijoude, Cassy, Couvre-Chef, Francqueville, Grouchy, Galmache and Lebissay had been turned into tank-proof strongpoints, with 88mm to deal with the advancing British and Canadian tanks, while Nebelwerfers and machine guns drenched their supporting infantry with mortar bombs and machine gun fire as they picked their way through the minefields. Nor were these defensive positions short of tenacious troops. These came from the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, backed by tank units of 21st Panzer, plus units of ISS Panzer Corps, 12th SS Panzer, elements of 1st SS Panzer and the 7th Werfer Mortar Brigade. Near the Orne, some miles south of the city, were the rest of 1 SS Panzer and a regiment of 3rd Flak Corps with more 88mm guns and 10 SS Panzer of 2nd Panzer Corps, now facing the 43rd Wessex Division across the Odon. To backstop this position, west of the Orne lay more elements of Sepp Dietrich's ISS Panzer Corps, deployed between the Orne and the Odon. Some of these units had been involved in the Odon offensive, the fight for Hill 112 and then for Carpique, and had been written down in the fighting, but they were fully prepared to go on fighting when that last attack at Carpiquet petered out on July 5th. During the brief pause after the Carpiquet battle, the British 59th Division came ashore and went into the line north of Caen, and responsibility for the next phase in this ongoing battle was handed to Lieutenant General Crocker's Arthur British Corps, now mustering 115,000 men. I British Corps would attack on July 8th with 3 infantry divisions, 3rd British on the left or east, 59th British in the centre, and 3rd Canadian on the right, or west. This assault infantry would have 2 armoured brigades, the 27th and 2nd Canadian, in close support, and another armoured brigade in Corps Reserve, ready to exploit forward if the chance arose. To overcome fixed defences, minefields and pillboxes, There would be the petard, flail, and flame-throwing tanks of the 79th Armoured Division, plus the usual abundance of artillery support from the guns of the 51st Highland and Guards Armoured Divisions, as well as from 2 Royal Artillery regiments. As this attack went in, the 43rd Division of 8th Corps would launch another attack south of Caen, in an attempt to cross the Orne at Saint-André, a move that must involve another costly attack on Hill 112. Added to this artillery support were the 16-inch guns of the battleship HMS Rodney and the monitor HMS Roberts, plus the guns of the 2 cruisers, HMS Belfast and HMS Emerald. HMS Rodney would deliver a pre-attack bombardment on the key position at Point 64, a low hill just north of Caen, which Dempsey and Crocker and their German opponents believed to be the key to the Caen defences. Finally, the Caen assault would be preceded by a devastating attack from 467 Lancaster and Halifax bombers of RAF Bomber Command, dropping 2,562 tons of bombs among the defenders' positions on the northern outskirts of the city. Personal accounts of the Normandy battle, especially from ground troops and tank crews, are full of grateful memories of the support the soldiers received from the air forces, mingled with some ironic accounts of being bombed or strafed by their own aircraft, the Germans having very few aircraft over the bridgehead, other than at night. Both the Allied air forces seem to have attacked their own troops to a greater or lesser degree. One bridgehead story alleges that when the Germans come over, the Allies take cover. When the RAF come over, the Germans take cover. When the Yanks come over, everyone takes cover. This mild slander on the US 9th Air Force should not conceal the fact that short bombing or strafing of own forces was an all too common occurrence in Normandy by all the Allied air forces, strategic as well as tactical, and steps to mitigate this evil were therefore taken at the highest level and built into the assault plans. This necessary caution had snags as well as benefits. For the bombing of Caen, it was considered that since this was the first time the heavy Lancaster and Halifax aircraft of RAF Bomber Command had been used in a tactical role in direct support of ground troops, the bombing should take place at least 6,000 metres in front of the Allied lines. 6,000 metres is almost 4 miles, and covering that distance, even without opposition and in good going, would take an infantry soldier loaded with equipment and weapons at least 2 hours. That was assuming everything went to plan, which it rarely did. It was more than probable that the ground the troops advanced over would be cratered by shells and bombs, and certain that any enemy troops surviving the bombing would rake the attacking British and Canadian formations with suppressive fire as they came on. All this was bad enough, but the bombing support plan contained a basic tactical flaw. While it is hoped that a heavy bombardment by bombs or shells will destroy enemy positions and kill soldiers, at least half the benefit comes from the fact that a heavy bombardment will leave the enemy dazed and in no condition to resist while the attacking troops move in. But such benefit depends on the attacking infantry arriving on the enemy position as soon as possible after the bombardment ends. That rule is absolutely basic, but on this occasion it was decided that the bombing would take place on the night of July 7th, between 9:50 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. The ground attack, however, would not go in until 4:20 a.m. the following day, July 8th, not for another 6 hours. Granted, the bombing would be followed up by constant shelling from the artillery, but when the time taken for the infantry to advance is factored in, the time lag between the bombing and the infantry actually getting into Caen still comes to around 8 hours. This delay was a serious tactical mistake. However heavy and accurate the artillery bombardment, the Germans were used to artillery fire, and their defences were proof against all but direct hits. Heavy bombing was a different proposition, but if the defenders were given all that time to pull themselves together, the attacking troops would reap little benefit from the pounding delivered by the RAF. Even though the shelling continued for most of the night, this objection remains valid. There was little point in RAF Bomber Command delivering such a heavy blow and then giving the enemy time to get over it. Charles Bedford of Victoria, British Columbia, was then serving with B Company, the 1st Battalion, the Manchester Regiment. We travelled to Normandy in a transport, the John L. Sutter. There were 12 Canadian generals on board, and our CO, Major Woolsey, was given command of all the military personnel, including the generals. He was the ship major. At the time of the great RAF raid on Caen, July 8th, we had taken over Carpiquet airfield from the Canadians and were slap bang in the middle of the field with orders to dig everything in 2 trucks, a jeep and a Bren gun carrier, with just our entrenching tools. A bulldozer would have been quite useful. On the northern edge of the field, tanks had been dug in, hull down, facing south towards the enemy, and Major Woolsey told us that we were facing dozens of German tanks who the brass hoped would attack us so we could knock them out. This never happened, but we were attacked by fighter aircraft, which caused much damage and chaos. A few hundred yards to our left, at Malto, the Germans had bayoneted some Canadian prisoners to death in an orchard, and more were killed in the abbey near Caen. Worst memories? The snipers, the dust, the smell, and burying a company of the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry, killed in the Odon bridgehead. That was the worst. The taking of Caen on July 8th to 9th has become established as a Canadian battle, although the bulk of the forces were British and all the forces engaged came under the command of General Crocker of 3rd British Corps. The 3rd Canadian Division were to come in on the right flank, and on their left flank, astride the road from Caen to Bayeux, lay the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade. This would move through the village of Carpiquet and on to Caen, with the rest of the 3rd Canadian Division advancing on a line from the Caen-Bayeux road, north and east to Vieux-Carrion. From there, the 59th Staffordshire Division was to sweep south towards Caen through Glamache and Saint-Contest and La Folie. East of there, north of Le Bessay, and occupying the line as far as the Caen Canal, was the 3rd British Division, which would come into the city via Le Bessay and Hérouville on the west bank of the canal. On July 7th, before the attack, the 2nd Army line lay about 3 miles outside the city, and the last mile of the advance into the city centre would be taken up with street fighting. Nor would it be possible to sweep quickly through the city once the outer defences had been overrun. Apart from the inevitable damage caused by bombing, with rubble blocking the streets, the Caen Canal ends in the city centre, which is occupied by an extensive dock area. Added to that is the River Orne, which, after curving into the city from the east and making an S-bend in the city centre, continues out to the north and extends back into the rugged Suisse Normande, where it is joined by the Odon, coming in from the west. The Caen Canal and the Orne therefore provided any force defending the city with a natural defence line in the city centre, and the possibility of withdrawing across the river, if pressed, to carry on the fight in the southern suburbs. This being so, the aim of this attack, Operation Charnwood, on July 8th was not to overrun the entire city, but take that part of the town that lies north and west of the Orne, and establish bridgeheads over the river to the suburb of Vaucelles. The attackers would advance to this point through the bombed area north of the city, an area shaped like a rectangle, 4,000 yards wide by 1,500 yards deep, while defences in the outlying villages, north and west of the city, would be reduced by shell fire. The 2 British divisions would strike first, from the north. After they were on the move and drawing enemy fire and attention, the 3rd Canadian Division would come in from the west. When all 3 divisions were inside the city, the Canadians were to finish the capture of Carpiquet airfield and mop up any remaining enemy resistance in the city itself, while the 2 British divisions took the bridges over the Orne and the Caen Canal, assuming they were still intact, and established those bridgeheads in the Vaucelles suburb. Charnwood duly began at 9:50 p.m. on July 7th, when RAF bombers pounded the northern outskirts of the city. They were followed by light bombers and ground attack fighters, which roamed over the Confalaise plain and attacked any movement detected on the ground at night, notably trains on the railway lines south of the city. An hour later, the artillery of I and 8th Corps opened up, supported by naval gunfire, again concentrating on the village strongpoints north of the city. This steady barrage went on all night and increased in intensity from 4:20 a.m. on July 8th, when the infantry and their supporting tanks went forward. The attack went well, although reports soon came in of heavy opposition, especially against the 59th Division in the villages north of the city. This opposition indicates that the defenders had already recovered from the bombing and shelling and were both alert and aggressive. In fact, although they had lost tanks and equipment in the bombing, the SS troops of the Hitler Jugend division had been well dug in and suffered very few casualties from the bombing. One account claims that the 12th SS lost just 2 Mark IV tanks and fewer than 20 men. The 1st SS lost even fewer. The 3rd Canadian Division was now on the move, following up the British attack, and the Canadian history reports that the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment was fighting with the bitterness expected of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Neil Hamilton was at Caen with the artillery of the 3rd Canadian Division. Artillery support was essential to knock out these SS positions. We called down artillery fire on the German lines, which might only be a matter of yards in front of our position, and often the shells would fall short, but that was better than not having it or risking being overrun in a counter-attack. We advanced into Caen behind a bulldozer. That was the only way, as the streets were blocked with rubble from the bombing. I remember seeing a church complete with steeple, which was the only place I recall standing. The Germans had fled the city by then, except for snipers who were active in the ruins and had to be rooted out. There were plenty of dead, men and horses, overturned tanks and vehicles, and crowds of people, French townsfolk, coming out to meet us. Close air support from 2nd Tactical Air Force arrived at dawn, followed at 7 a.m. by light bombers of the US 9th Air Force, attacking the village strongpoints and any traffic on the roads. July 8th saw some extremely heavy fighting, especially for Point 64 in the 3rd British Division sector, which was struck repeatedly by shells from HMS Rodney, but still managed to produce a heavy volume of defensive fire. The second phase of the advance to the villages of Éperon and Saint-Contest on the British front and the Canadian attack on Buron commenced at 7:30 a.m. on the left around Le Bessay. The attack went well, but on the centre and right the British and Canadians had much more trouble, the SS resisting stubbornly and putting in constant counterattacks with tanks and infantry. The attack in the centre by the 59th Division was held up in the villages of Éperon and Saint-Contest and by a suddenly discovered German trench line west of La Béjoude. General Crocker therefore decided to reinforce 59th Division, sending tanks onto Point 64 on their right and putting the Corps Reserve, the 33rd Armoured Brigade, under 59th Division command. Meanwhile, the Canadians and their regular opponents, the 12th SS Panzer, were locked in combat in the village of Buron, northwest of Saint-Contest. This day-long battle followed the familiar pattern attack, followed by counterattack. But the Canadian soldiers had the measure of these SS troops by now, and after a battery of 17-pounder anti-tank guns came up to deal with the panzers, knocking out 13 German tanks. In the course of the day, the Canadians took Buron and held it against several attempts by the SS to take it back. The SS finally pulled out in the evening, but Canadian losses had been high. In the fight for the village of Buron, the Highland Light Infantry of Canada lost 262 men, of whom 62 were killed, their highest single-day loss in the entire Normandy campaign. The village of Grouchy, west of Buron, fell after the Canadian infantry had stormed through the centre in Bren gun carriers, but German resistance was strong everywhere, and the Charnwood attack began to fall behind schedule. Buron was not secured until after dark. The village of Cussy was not taken by the Canadians until 6:30 p.m, and Ardennes, on the western edge of the bombed zone outside the city, did not fall until the following morning. A similar story can be told about the attack of 59th Division. Progress was steady but slow. Although Saint-Contest fell, other places held out, and it was soon apparent that when the SS troops were evicted from one village strongpoint, far from retreating, they simply fell back to reinforce the troops holding another one. As a result, the opposition to the Second Army attack grew rather than diminished as the day wore on. One clear success was the capture of Point 64 by the 3rd British Division, which thereby reached the point they had hoped to occupy on D-Day, and that night the division sent patrols into the city. Crocker then decided to hold 59th Division where it was, leaning on the northern defences, and leave the clearing of the city to the 2 flanking divisions, 3rd Canadian and 3rd British. The Germans, too, had taken a pounding. That evening, Kurt Meyer, now commanding the 12th SS, and a man the Canadians were very anxious to get their hands on, reported to Sepp Dietrich that the 16th Luftwaffe Division had collapsed, that his right flank was dangerously exposed, and that the British had penetrated the outskirts of Caen. 1st SS Battalion had been forced out of La Bougeaude. Éperon was about to fall. Grouchy, Francoville, and at last Carpiquet Airfield were all in Canadian hands, and the 1st SS Flak Battery, whose 88mm guns had taken a heavy toll of Canadian tanks, had been overrun and wiped out. General Crocker could be well pleased with the achievements of his corps on July 8th. Heavy fighting continued in the northern suburbs of Caen throughout July 9th. There was a particularly heavy battle around Ardennes Abbey on the western suburbs of the city, where Kurt Meyer had his headquarters. Just as the position looked like falling, Meyer summoned up more support in the shape of a company of Panther tanks and elements of 1 SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment from the 1 SS Panzer Division. A fierce tank and infantry battle went on around the abbey until well after dark, but although Meyer hung on to the position until midnight, by dawn he and his remaining troops had withdrawn. In spite of this opposition and heavy losses in tanks and men, the British and Canadian assault on Caen therefore went well, but their advance slowed perceptibly when the troops entered the city. However valid or debatable accusations about British slowness might be on other occasions, they were not justified in the shattered streets of Caen. The centre of the city was a ruin, the houses destroyed by bombing and shelling, the narrow streets filled with rubble and blocks of quarried stone, sometimes to the level of the first-floor windows, the wider avenues blocked by fallen trees and toppled lamp-posts. Progress, even on foot, was inevitably slow, and in tanks or armoured cars virtually impossible. The main requirement in Caen on July 9th was for bulldozers. Among these broken buildings and tucked into the rubble, snipers lurked, picking off the officers and tank commanders, stalking the tanks with Panzerfausts. The Germans might have made a good fight for days in the wreckage of Caen, but following Rommel's order to Panzer Group West on the night of July 8th to 9th, General Eberbach had moved all the tanks and heavy guns out of Caen to a line on the west bank of the River Orne, around the village of Bretteville-sur-Odon, south of Carpiquet. It was now apparent to the German commanders, even to the dauntless Kurt Meyer, that Caen was about to fall. This being so, Meyer requested permission to pull his men back across the Orne, a request that Sepp Dietrich reluctantly refused. Dietrich had a problem. In view of Hitler's demands that every metre of ground should be held and Caen must be held at all costs, he could not order a withdrawal. On the other hand, if they stayed where they were, they would soon be overrun. It was eventually decided that if Meyer's men were thrown back to the south of the Orne by superior numbers, the Führer could not consider that a retreat. Meyer's men duly pulled back, having lost 423 men, killed, wounded and missing in the previous 2 days, as well as 10 Panthers and 22 Mark IV tanks. 12 SS still left plenty of infantry and anti-tank guns to hold the streets and take a steady toll of the attackers when they came on again at Vaucelles. Crocker's corps resumed the advance at dawn on July 9th and found the resistance put up by the Germans far less troublesome than the rubble-filled and cratered streets left by the bombing. The advance went ahead, if slowly, and by evening all 3 divisions were within the city and up to the west side of the Orne. After 4 weeks, Caen had finally fallen, but the southern suburbs beyond the Orne were still in German hands. The last 2 days had been expensive to both sides. In taking Caen, my corps had lost 3,500 men, the 59th British and 3rd Canadian Division losing about 1,000 men each. 80 British or Canadian tanks had also been destroyed. On the other hand, the Germans had not escaped lightly either. The 16th Luftwaffe Division has lost 75% of its men, including all the battalion commanders, while the infantry strength of the 12th SS Panzer Division had been reduced to a battalion about 600 men. Very few of these SS troops had surrendered. Only about 600 prisoners entered the I Corps cages. Those who were not dead or wounded were as ready as ever to fight another day. The bombing of Caen on the night of July 7th was accurate, and according to the Canadian official history, extremely impressive. Smoke and flame wonderful for morale. Everything on our front seems to be in flame. Cannot get anything more accurate. As a bonus, no RAF bombs had fallen among the waiting British and Canadian troops, but whether the bombing did any great harm to the German defenders in their deep dugouts is debatable. Again, according to the Canadian official history, 12 SS Panzer said they suffered only negligible casualties, although numerous bombs fell in the assembly area. Some tanks and armoured personnel carriers were toppled over or buried under debris from bombed houses, but after a short while most of them were again ready for action. On the other hand, interrogation of captured prisoners seems to suggest, according to reports at the 21st Army Group, that the bombing was decisive and the morale effect considerable. Those who fought the SS over the next few days might doubt that claim. What is not disputed is that the bombing did terrible damage to the old city of Caen. Although the number of civilian casualties at around 400 seems mercifully low, when the Allied troops entered the city, the inhabitants came out cheerfully to greet them, but the city was in ruins. The warm reception the inhabitants of Caen gave the Allied troops was welcome, for the country people of Normandy had given sour reception to the Allied troops and seemed far from willing to be liberated. At least the Germans had not killed their cattle or shelled their farmhouses. The peasants blamed the inevitable destruction of the battle on their American, British and Canadian liberators, though due praise must be given to the help and support given to the Allies by the men of the Ff.1, the French resistance, the Maquis. The fall of Caen was a great relief to all the Allied commanders, not least to General Montgomery. The capture of Caen, he stated, greatly simplified our problems on the eastern flank, as we had now eliminated the German salient west of the river and were well placed to continue operations by extending our bridgehead to the west of it. With Caen now mostly in his hands, General Dempsey elected to tidy up his line west of the city by finishing off the attack over the Odon at Hill 112. This was a renewal of the bloody battle at the end of June, and this time the task was entrusted to the 43rd Division. With the usual massive support from the air and artillery, their attack Operation Jupiter went in at 5 a.m. on July 10th. The day after Caen fell, there was no let-up in the fighting on the Second Army front. The task of the 43rd Division was to break out of the Odon bridgehead, which now lay between Versen and Barron, take Hill 112, and advance southeast to the Orne. Major General G. von Thomas, known as Butcher to his men, decided that his infantry division, with tank support, should take Hill 112 and the village of Maltot just to the east, while the 4th Armoured Brigade and the 46th Highland Brigade, which were attached to the 43rd Division for this operation, would exploit forward to the Orne at Saint-André. Artillery support would be provided by the guns of 2 artillery groups and the 2 other divisions of 8th Corps, 15th Scottish and 11th Armoured, and the 43rd Division attack opened at 5 a.m. on July 10. The initial advance went well. By 8 a.m. the leading troops were on the slopes of Hill 112, advancing over ground still littered with the debris of the previous battle, had got into the village of Etreville and were fighting their way into Maltot. It gradually became clear, as in the previous Odon crossing, that this village and the country around it could not be taken and held while the Germans occupied Hill 112. On Hill 112, the British infantry were at close quarters with the defenders, and the 4th Battalion Somerset Light Infantry had managed to get up the north slope and halfway across the crest before they were held up by heavy machine gun and mortar fire. Douglas Proctor, then a corporal in the 4th Battalion. The Somerset Light Infantry writes about his experience on Hill 112 on July 10th at 8. The battalion had failed to clear and capture the forward slope of Hill 112, so while we firm based on our hard-won gains, the 5th Cornwalls, 5th Battalion, the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, attacked through us with the intention of clearing the entire feature. Within a matter of hours, they had been decimated. Their attack reached just over the brow of the hill to a small wood where they were cut to pieces by murderous machine gun and mortar fire. Enemy tanks occupied the wood and they had a field day, slaughtering the hapless Cornwalls. Eventually, survivors trickled back to the safety of our line and were formed into one company to help defend our slope. That night and all the next day we held fast, suffering under intense German mortar fire. Corporal Proctor's officer in 18 Platoon was a 20-year-old second lieutenant from the Hampshire Regiment, Sidney Jari, who arrived just after this first engagement. The 43rd Division's major battle had been Hill 112. On July 5th, 3 officers and 62 other ranks were required as reinforcements. Between 14th and 18th July, a further 12 officers, of whom I was one, and 479 men arrived, and still the Somerset Battalion was below its full strength of 36 officers and nearly 500 men, 800 NCOs and men. This will give some idea of the appalling level of infantry casualties which had to be accepted to enlarge the slender and vulnerable Normandy beachhead. Despite not being a Somerset, or even from one of the other excellent light infantry regiments, I was at once made welcome, and therefore decided not to ask for a transfer to the 7th Hampshires in 130 Brigade, and I was soon sucked into the real infantry battle as commander of 18 Platoon D Company. In 1944, the war establishment of a British infantry platoon was 36 men. It consisted of 3 rifle sections, each of 10 men including a Bren gunner, each commanded by a corporal or sometimes a lance sergeant. There was also a small platoon HQ with a 2-inch mortar detachment, a Piat anti-tank weapon, the platoon sergeant and the commander's Batman runner. On 31st July, 18 Platoon consisted of 17 all ranks, 12 of them recent replacements. Hill 112 and Bricassard had claimed the rest. Another account of the fighting for Hill 112 comes from Field Marshal Lord Carver, then commanding the 4th Armoured Brigade. Thomas's plan was for 2 brigades of his division to capture the ridge, Hill 112. 4th Armoured Brigade were then to thrust through 6 miles to the Orne and try to capture a bridge. It looked like Balaclava all over again. The only stipulation I insisted on was that before launching my leading regiment over the crest, the square wood on its reverse slope must be firmly in our hands. If it were not, my tanks would be shot up from the rear as they went forward. After further heated argument and objections from the infantry, this was agreed. The infantry attack was launched, with the tanks of the 9th RTR, supporting the final phase of the attack being almost all knocked out by anti-tank fire from this wood, which the infantry had not cleared. Having confirmed this myself, I said I would not order my leading regiment over the crest until the wood had been cleared. As agreed, Thomas then came on the set and said that his information, from the infantry brigadiers, was that all objectives had been secured and I must start my forward thrust. I said I was on the spot, as his infantry brigadiers were not, and that if he did not believe me he could come and see for himself. This, not surprisingly, did not please him. He insisted that I should order my tanks to advance over the crest. I said that if I did, I expected the leading regiment to take at least 75% casualties. He asked me what regiment I proposed to send. I told him it was the Greys. "Couldn't you send a less well-known regiment?" he replied, at which I blew up. Finally, he accepted my arguments. Brigadier Carver's view was all too accurate. An officer of the Greys reported that the skyline of Hill 112 was dominated by Churchill tanks brewing up, not a pretty sight. They had gone too far over the ridge and been knocked out by the enemy, who were in extremely good positions. There were dead and wounded men lying all over the ground in the long grass, rifles stuck in the ground marking the positions of their owners. A gruesome sight. Fortunately, matters went better elsewhere in the 43rd Division area. The 5th Dorsets got into the Château de Fontaine soon after dawn, but were held there until the afternoon. The 4th Dorsets, advancing with tank support during the morning, had reached Etreville, from which the 22nd SS Panzer Grenadier and the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadiers had been forced to withdraw. The 7th Hampshires had taken Malteau, but could not hold it when a German counterattack came in. By mid-morning, 9 of the tanks supporting the Hampshires had been knocked out, and then Tiger tanks came rumbling into the village with plenty of supporting infantry. By early afternoon, the Hampshires had been driven out and losses were mounting. This reverse called for a British counterattack, which was mounted by the 4th Dorsets and a squadron of the 9th RTR at 4:20 p.m. that afternoon. The battle for Malta swayed to and fro for the rest of the day, attack following counterattack. By dawn on July 11th, Malta was back in German hands, and the 9th Cameronians, which had relieved the battered 4th Dorsets, held Etreville. Casualties were heavy on both sides. One company of the 3rd SS Battalion lost 44 men on the night of July 10th to 11th. The Glasgow Highlanders lost 85 men in the space of 2 hours in Etreville, and still the fighting continued. Charles Bedford of the 1st Manchesters took part in this fighting on the Odon. We took over from the 15th Scottish sometime in early July near Cheux, the forward part of the forward area, and were greeted with a heavy stonking from German Nebelwerfers and suffered heavy casualties. The whole battalion was in slit trenches, and the visits to the MMG platoons, 3 Vickers platoons, each with 4 MMGs, had to be timed to when the enemy was otherwise engaged. The moaning minis were our biggest worry. On one occasion, a No. 1 gunner was halfway into his slit when a mortar bomb exploded 2 yards away and almost cut him in two. The shelling was pretty horrendous, and it was far more dangerous in wooded areas when the shells detonated above in the branches and shrapnel cascaded downwards. Airbursts exploded about 6 feet from the ground and sprayed shrapnel like an umbrella. Very nasty. On one attack on Hill 112, the enemy waited until the infantry reached the top and then opened up on them from Eversea with everything they had and forced them back to their start line. We fired all our Vickers guns in support of this attack, which led to the enemy locating B Company and mortaring them. All 3 platoon commanders were killed. That night, July 10th, the Germans on the southern half of Hill 112, most of them from the 1st SS Panzer, put in attacks which began just after midnight on July 10th to 11th, continued for much of the following day, and succeeded in retaking about half of Hill 112. In this battle, the 5th DCLY, Duke of Cornwall's light infantry, lost 240 men, a casualty rate of 40%. This sharp battle around Hill 112 cost the 43rd Infantry Division over 2,000 casualties, and very little ground was gained. Etreville had fallen, but the Germans held Malto, while Hill 112 was half British, half German. Both sides of the ridge were now littered with dead and the debris of war. Brian Clark, commanding a troop of Churchill tanks, took part in this battle with the 147th Armoured Regiment, part of the 34th Armoured Brigade. Hill 112 was a mess. If you ever want to see what a battlefield was like, this was it. The entire area was covered with burnt-out tanks, dead bodies, and all the wreckage of war, usually under a pall of smoke from shell and mortar bursts. The Germans seemed to have been at the bottom of the hill, certainly when I was there, but they were always ready to have a go, always aggressive, so you had to be aggressive back, or they would have walked right over you. We moved up towards Eversea on the 15th of July, and the attack was to start at Barron. We were now with our corps, and we saw the RAF raid on Caen on July 10th, sitting on our tanks. We also inspected a Churchill which had received a direct hit, probably from an 88mm, and been blown apart, not an encouraging sight. It was a night move black as pitch, but eventually we met the tanks of our sister regiment, the 153, and we knew we were in the right area. We followed a flail tank into a minefield, but it then blew up on a mine, so we had to reverse out as the infantry were coming up and the mortar bombs were coming down. The mortaring went on most of the time we were on Hill 112 and caused a lot of casualties. My squadron commander then ordered me to take my troop of tanks up 112 and let the Germans know we were there by firing into Esquay, but not into Bon Repos, the next village. By this time both villages were heaps of rubble, but we went up 112, myself leading, followed by Sergeant Frampton and Corporal Shipman. In my regiment the officer always led. The side of 112 was pockmarked with shell holes, and there was a lot of smoke drifting about, but we were able to move up behind 3 shot-up Sherman tanks and into the turret-down position, just below the crest. On the way there I had been struck by the most dreadful smell. You got used to smells in Normandy, mostly dead cattle that were lying about, their legs in the air like overturned vaulting horses, but this was quite different. Then, on the left, I saw some slit trenches with British infantry, dead infantry, grossly bloated and leaning out of their slits, and this was the source of that terrible smell. From our turret-down position we worked out which heap of rubble was Esquay, and fired about 15 rounds of HE into it to let the Germans know we were there. From where we were, we saw German Panther tanks firing on our 153 Regiment as they moved through an area we called the Gully, by Gavras. The German tank commanders were standing on the backs of their tanks directing the fire, and many of the 153 Regiment tanks were on fire or knocked out. By the end of the day, they had lost 29 out of 54 Churchills. We tried to help out by firing He at the Panthers. It was too far for armour-piercing, and we may have shook them up a bit. The only benefit was that this attack, together with the taking of Caen, obliged the Germans to keep crack forces and tank units on the Second Army front and wear them out fighting for Caen and Hill 112, which General Eberbach had told Sepp Dietrich of ISS Panzer Corps was the pivotal point of the entire position. In no circumstances must it be surrendered. This role, fights for position to write down the enemy strength, seems to have become the role of the British in Normandy. Their task was to pin the Germans in position and wear them down, often at terrible cost. Corporal Douglas Proctor of the 4th Somersets again. Our assault on Hill 112 was a set-piece battalion attack, but due to the enemy's overwhelming superiority in men and firepower, it was only partially successful. The cost in casualties was too awful to comprehend. The battalion, as we had known it, no longer existed. Out of the 36 men in 18 platoon who so bravely went into battle, only 9 remained, a 75% casualty rate. The results of Charnwood and Jupiter were mixed. Caen had fallen. Well, half of Caen had fallen. The Germans still held on across the Orne, even if their position was fundamentally untenable. The British had also extended their bridgehead across the Odon and taken half of Hill 112, but in both cases these gains had been made in the face of fierce opposition and at terrible cost. German losses were also high, but the writing down of their forces by the British and Canadians before Caen was not the only problem currently facing von Kluge and his commanders. On July 3rd, the US First Army, following Monty's directive of June 30th, struck out again for Saint-Lô. Here, as with the British before Caen, they met stiff resistance and were soon entangled yet again in the bocage, but they kept going, and Saint-Lô was soon being threatened. On July 7th, this growing threat forced von Kluge to move Panzer Lehr west to meet the Americans moving on Saint-Lô, replacing Panzer Lehr in the British front with the 276th Infantry Division. Panzer Lehr arrived on July 11th and went into action that day alongside 2 SS Panzer, Das Reich, which had been opposing the Americans for the last week. It is frequently alleged that the British made little or no progress in the east, and that this lack of territorial gain was a clear sign of hesitation or failure. The reasons why they made so few territorial gains and why that failure was strategically unimportant have been covered already but will be discussed again, for the argument continued. It might also be asked, in view of this fact, that the bulk of the German armour and the powerful and aggressive SS divisions were on the Second Army front, why American progress in the western sector had been so slow. To which the short answer is the bocage, the weather, and the enemy. However, Montgomery's overall strategy was sound. The British and Canadians kept the panzers busy in the east so that the Americans could make progress in the west. This being so news that a crack unit like Panzer Lehr had been sent west was not one Monty would welcome. The panzer divisions must be kept in the east, and if the only way to keep them there was by constantly attacking, then another attack there must be. This continuing operation, referred to above, would therefore be the next major phase in the eastern bridgehead, another effort to hold the panzer units in the British and Canadian sector. But before we look at that attack, Operation Goodwood, it is time to move to the west and see how the American divisions were getting on as they battered their way out of the Cotentin and towards Saint-Lô in the early days of July.